Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely night, and tonight I shall share with you an account about those forgotten outcasts who were cast aside and left to die in the long shadows of the Dark Ages, the poor, the sick, the broken, and the unwanted, whose existence was marked by silence and suffering in a harsh and unforgiving world. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. When the Roman order collapsed, the land was left scattered, its people wandering among ruins of stone and memory. Roads that once carried grain and law fell silent, and with silence came hunger. I walked through villages where the air was heavy with smoke, yet the hearths inside were cold because no bread was left to bake. Life itself seemed fragile, like a candle too close to the wind. One gust, and it was gone, leaving only darkness and the smell of wax burned too fast. Every face I passed bore the weight of uncertainty. Men carried ploughs into barren fields, praying for soil that would not betray them. Women clutched thin children, their eyes wide with the knowledge that death was always near. A broken harvest, a fevered night, or a passing raid could steal everything. No promise of tomorrow was certain, and each dawn was greeted with both relief and dread. The sound of church bells reminded us more of burials than of joy. The poor were the most vulnerable, for they owned nothing but their breath, and even that was easily taken. Hunger bent their backs, cold weather stiffened their limbs, and disease crept quietly into their bones. Communities could not afford to shelter the weak, for survival demanded labor, and labor demanded strength. Those who could not carry tools or wield weapons became burdens in a world that punished frailty. I remember their eyes, hollow and unblinking, like wells run dry. War only deepened these shadows. Lords sent their men to fight, leaving villages without defenders or laborers. Raiders and bandits followed in their wake, taking what little remained. Charred houses stood as blackened reminders of battles that never cared for peasants. I once stood in the ashes of such a place, where only a half-burned cradle was left. In that cradle, silence was louder than any battle drum. Famine visited often, cruel and without pity. In the lean years, people boiled bark and chewed grass to quiet the screams of empty stomachs. Chronicles tell of mothers who left infants by the roadside, knowing they would not survive another winter. I saw it once, a tiny figure swaddled in rags, alone by the frozen ditch, while the village walked on with bowed heads. Mercy could not outweigh the pull of survival, and so compassion was buried beneath necessity. Disease was another thief, moving unseen, striking without sword or arrow. Fevers swept through towns, leaving bodies piled like firewood. The sick were feared, shunned, and sometimes locked in their homes so that death might claim them without spreading further. I can still recall the sound of coughing echoing through shuttered doors, and then silence. There were no physicians for the poor, only prayers whispered into smoke and wind. Even those with strength lived as though walking a narrow bridge above an abyss. One wrong step, a poor harvest, a broken bone, a raid, and the fall was certain. In such a world, the fragile ones had no footing at all. Their cries were short-lived, swallowed by the harsher voices of need and fear. Every grave dug into the frozen earth seemed to whisper the same truth. Survival was never promised. Looking back, I see the fragility of life, not only in those who perished, but in the hearts of all who lived. Fear of becoming one of the forgotten kept every man's hand upon the plough and every woman's gaze upon the hearth. We clung to our labours because to falter meant to vanish. The Dark Ages were not merely dark in name, but in the quiet cruelty of a world where weakness found no shelter. Poverty in the Middle Ages was more than the absence of coin. It was a mark etched upon the soul by the eyes of others. Those who wore ragged garments and stretched out hands for bread were judged not only by their neighbors, but also by the laws of men and God. The church spoke of poverty as holy when embraced by monks, yet condemned it as shameful when it clung unwillingly to the backs of the common people. In this contradiction, the poor carried a double burden: hunger and disgrace. I recall seeing beggars outside cathedral doors, pressing their bodies against the stone in hope of alms. Pilgrims tossed a coin or a crust, yet whispers often followed, accusations of sloth, warnings of deceit. Priests preached charity, but sermons also thundered against idleness, casting suspicion upon those who had nothing to give. It was a cruel paradox, for poverty demanded help, yet those who suffered it were treated as sinners in disguise. Local rulers sought to control this wandering misery. In some towns, councils declared that beggars without ties to the community should be expelled. Whips and stocks were the punishments for those who persisted, turning need into crime. To be poor was to walk a narrow road between mercy and punishment, never knowing which face society would show. I once saw a woman beaten not for stealing bread, but merely for asking for it. The distrust ran deeper than hunger. Chronic beggars, those whose faces became familiar outside the markets, were often accused of choosing their condition. Many believed they feigned weakness or illness, hiding strength behind trembling hands. Such suspicion poisoned compassion, making every act of giving feel tainted with doubt. Charity became not an embrace, but a test of conscience, weighed down by mistrust. And yet, the church still taught that almsgiving cleansed sin. Wealthy lords and merchants often gave not out of love, but out of fear for their own souls. Donations to monasteries, coins dropped into begging bowls, bread distributed on feast days. These acts were as much transactions with heaven as gestures of kindness. The poor became the stage upon which the rich sought salvation. Their suffering was a currency, not a bond of brotherhood. The daily life of the destitute was one of wandering. They drifted from town to town, often carrying nothing but a walking stick and the clothes upon their backs. Inns and homes shut their doors, forcing them to sleep under bridges or in fields. Hunger hollowed their faces, and their presence reminded all who passed of the thin veil separating survival from despair. Few wished to look too long, lest they see their own future reflected. In the eyes of many, poverty was not only an earthly condition, but a divine message. Some believed it a punishment for hidden sins, others, a trial meant to cleanse the soul. Both interpretations isolated the sufferer further, turning every gaze into judgment. A beggar's life was not just stripped of comfort, but also of dignity, as if the loss of bread also meant the loss of worth. What remains with me still is the silence that followed them. Villagers turned their faces, guards drove them off, and even fellow poor feared sharing what little they had. Poverty carried a weight heavier than hunger, the weight of rejection. To be destitute was to live in the shadow of suspicion, marked not only by empty hands, but by the scorn of the very world that preached compassion. Among the many fears that haunted medieval life, none carried such dread as leprosy. The disease, with its slow decay of flesh and numbness of limb, seemed to strip away both body and soul. I remember how whispers alone could condemn a man. The mere suspicion of blemished skin or twisted fingers was enough to cast him beyond the walls. To be declared a leper was not only to face illness, but to endure a living death, severed from family, faith, and community. Those marked by this affliction were forced into separation. Leper colonies, often set beyond the town gates or along lonely roads, served as their only refuge. Walls and ditches kept them apart, as though stones could contain contagion. I once rode past such a colony, huts of rough timber, smoke rising faintly, and silence deeper than any battlefield. The faces that peered out carried both resignation and longing, as if life had been exchanged for exile. Society demanded that they make their presence known. carriers of bells, clappers, or wooden rattles, they were obliged to announce themselves whenever they drew near. The sound was chilling, a hollow rhythm that warned others to keep away. I can still hear the echo of a clapper in the night, its rattle breaking the stillness like a confession of guilt. No greeting followed, only avoidance, as though the sound itself carried the disease. The church gave them rites of separation, ceremonies akin to funerals for the living. A priest would lead them out, clad in black, pronouncing them dead to the world though their hearts still beat. Their names were struck from parish rolls, and their places at the table left empty. Such ritual was meant to protect the community, but for the afflicted, it was the cruelest wound of all, to be buried in memory while still drawing breath. Even family ties dissolved under fear's weight. Parents turned away from children, husbands from wives, friends from companions of decades. Few dared defy the law of distance. Those who showed mercy by offering food at the roadside did so quickly, dropping bread into outstretched hands without touch. I once saw a mother toss a loaf across a ditch to her son, tears falling, but her feet rooted firmly on her side of safety. Medical knowledge offered little comfort. Physicians spoke of humors out of balance, of divine punishment or inherited sin. Treatments were scarce and often cruel, burning herbs, purges, or baths that only deepened weakness. For many, faith became the only balm, though prayers often went unanswered. Their suffering was explained away as the will of God, making their exclusion not only permitted, but sanctified in the eyes of the healthy. And yet, despite all, lepers were not entirely forgotten. Some monasteries and charitable orders offered care, building hospitals where the afflicted might find shelter. Still, even within those walls, they were kept apart, marked by stigma as much as by sores. The leprosarium was both refuge and prison, reminding them daily that charity did not erase the label of outcast. When I think of them now, I recall not the disease but the silence that surrounded them. They were erased from common life, their voices fading into the rattle of clappers and the tolling of bells. To live as a leper in those centuries was to endure exile in plain sight, walking among men yet belonging to no one, a mirror of mortality that society refused to face. In a world where survival was measured by strength of body, those who could not walk or see bore a heavier cross than hunger alone. The blind, groping their way through narrow alleys, and the lame, dragging weary limbs along muddy roads, stood apart from the rhythm of daily labor. Fields, workshops, and armies had no place for them, and so they lived on the margins of usefulness. I remember their silent presence outside churches, their hands outstretched not for glory but for bread. Sightless men often sang hymns or psalms in doorways, their voices trembling yet filled with devotion. Music was sometimes their only gift, a fragile thread binding them to a society that would otherwise pass them by. Still, their songs rarely earned more than a coin or two, tossed with pity rather than respect. Those who were lame leaned on crutches or sticks, bodies bent in ways that spoke of war wounds, accidents, or birth's cruel design. The church taught compassion, urging the faithful to see Christ in the broken, yet in practice, charity was fleeting. Many believed blindness or lameness to be divine punishment or proof of hidden sin. Mothers whispered warnings to their children not to stare, as though the gaze itself might draw misfortune. Thus, suffering became a spectacle and a stigma, both visible and invisible, haunting every step the afflicted took. At fairs and marketplaces, I often saw them gathered at the gates, unable to afford the wares within. Merchants scowled, fearing theft, while guards drove them back with the butts of their staffs. Those with twisted limbs crawled on hands and knees to beg for scraps, enduring not only pain but humiliation. The earth itself seemed to reject them, as if the mud clung tighter to their skin than to others. Some found shelter in religious houses, where monks offered bread and a place near the cloister. Yet even there, they remained set apart, dependent entirely upon the goodwill of others. They could not write manuscripts, tend vineyards, or join the chanting in full measure. Their presence reminded the brethren of weakness, a mirror many avoided. Even among those sworn to compassion, the blind and the lame lived in shadows. Among knights, the lame were once our brothers, broken by battle. When swords left men unable to march, their service ended at the castle gate. Few lords kept them, most were dismissed with little more than a blessing. I watched comrades reduced from warriors to beggars, their scars no longer badges of honor but marks of burden. Their loyalty to banners was forgotten as swiftly as the battles they survived. In towns, some blind men were led by children, their steps cautious, their ears tuned to the echo of footsteps. These children, often their kin, carried the weight of guiding and protecting them, yet shared in their poverty. It was a fragile partnership born of necessity, not safety. Without such help, many would wander into ditches, or worse, into the path of horses and carts. When I think back, it is not their weakness that lingers in my mind, but the cruelty of indifference around them. Blind eyes still saw the world's rejection, and twisted legs still carried the weight of scorn. They lived, but always at the edge, tolerated only so long as their presence did not demand too much. Theirs was a life of endurance, not dignity, bound forever to the margins of medieval existence. When the pestilence of the 14th century swept across Europe, it struck with a swiftness that left no room for reason. One day, a man might labor in the fields, and the next he lay fevered, his body darkened with swellings. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself, and it gnawed through families as surely as it did flesh. I saw doors bolted from the outside, locking the afflicted within, as if walls could hold back the hand of death. Villages turned ghostly in mere weeks. Entire households lay silent, their hearths cold, their windows shuttered. Travellers spoke of towns where only the toll of church bells remained, ringing for so many funerals that the ropes frayed from use. Priests, overwhelmed by the tide of corpses, sometimes fled themselves, leaving the sacraments unspoken. The faithful buried their dead without rites, or left them unburied altogether, for terror silenced even devotion. Abandonment became a shield against infection. Parents deserted children, wives left husbands, brothers refused to tend to sisters. Those who once shared bread and toil recoiled from one another, fearing the touch of death upon the skin. The bonds of family, forged by years of hardship, were severed in an instant. I still recall the hollow sound of a child crying alone in a house where no one dared enter. The scale of loss was beyond comprehension. In some parishes, records show that half the souls vanished in a season. The sick were often carried on carts and dumped into pits, earth thrown hastily over them. These mass graves swallowed not only bodies, but memories, as names went unrecorded. It was as though the plague demanded both life and dignity, consuming identity along with breath. Some resisted the instinct to flee, and their courage remains in memory. There were nuns who stayed beside the sick, wiping brows with cloth soaked in vinegar. There were priests who gave last rites until their own lungs failed. Yet for every soul of mercy, dozens turned away, unable to bear the stench of infection or the certainty of their own doom. Compassion flickered, but fear often smothered the flame. The wealthy fared no better, for no coin could bribe the pestilence. Lords retreated to distant manors, closing gates against the desperate. Still, the plague seeped through, carried by servants or by rats in grain. In cities, silence filled the squares once crowded with traders and merchants. The dead outnumbered the living, and the living sometimes envied the dead. Even kings trembled, for their crowns offered no protection. I remember riding past a hamlet where the fields had grown wild, untended because no hands remained. Roofs sagged, doors swung open in the wind, and cattle wandered free. It was as though the land itself had abandoned man, reclaiming what he once tamed. The sight carried a chill deeper than any winter, for it spoke of a world where life could vanish without trace. The plague revealed how fragile loyalty and care truly were. In the end, fear ruled over love, and the sick were left behind to die alone. Their absence became a silence that stretched across generations, shaping memory itself. To this day, when I hear the toll of a distant bell, I recall not the grandeur of churches, but the forsaken cries of those abandoned in their final hour. Few burdens in the Middle Ages were heavier than a mind in turmoil. Those who spoke to unseen voices, who laughed or wept without cause, were regarded with dread. Villagers whispered of demons lodged in the soul, or of divine punishment etched into flesh and thought. I remember faces twisted not by disease of the body, but by anguish that could not be named. In their suffering, they were not comforted, but feared, for the unknown stirred more terror than the sword. The church often declared such afflictions to be signs of possession. Priests performed exorcisms, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water upon trembling bodies. Some improved, others did not, yet all carried the mark of suspicion thereafter. To live under such a shadow meant every gesture was judged. A simple cry at night could rouse a mob, eager to cast out what they believed was evil. Mercy was rare when fear guided hands. Superstition twisted compassion into cruelty. Men and women who wandered aimlessly, muttering to themselves, were mocked and pelted with stones. Children were taught to laugh at them, while adults crossed themselves as they passed. Those unable to control their fits or strange movements were chained in barns, or worse, driven into the wilderness to fend for themselves. I once saw a man with wild eyes chased from a village with torches, his cries swallowed by the dark. Institutions of care were almost unknown. Some monasteries offered shelter, placing the afflicted in quiet cloisters, yet even there chains were common. The silence of stone walls was thought to calm troubled spirits, though in truth it often deepened despair. Herbal remedies were given, but knowledge was poor and results fleeting. To be mad in those centuries was to be a prisoner without crime, punished for a mystery no one understood. Many wandered as beggars, their clothes in tatters, their hair unkempt. They lived on scraps and slept in fields, their company the stars and stray dogs. Hunger sharpened their suffering, and cold winters sealed many fates. Some became known in towns by their strangeness, remembered not by names, but by mockery. Laughter at their expense was cruel comfort for others, who thanked God it was not their own minds broken. Fear of contagion extended beyond disease of the body. People thought madness itself might spread. Families sometimes hid afflicted kin in attics or sheds, ashamed to be associated with them. Their voices carried through the planks at night, unheard except by the wind. I recall a woman who sang to herself endlessly, her song trembling yet strangely beautiful, while her village tried to pretend she did not exist. And yet there were rare sparks of gentleness. A kind priest who took in a troubled boy, a nun who whispered prayers of comfort instead of curses. Such mercy shone like small candles against the vast dark, though they could not change the greater truth. Fear outweighed compassion, and the mentally ill remained among the most forsaken souls of the age. Their lives were stories half heard, spoken only in whispers. When I ponder those days, it is the silence after their cries that echoes most. Madness was not met with understanding, but with exile, whether through walls, chains, or the loneliness of wandering. They became symbols of a world that feared what it could not explain, a mirror of fragility that few dared face. Their suffering was real, yet their dignity was denied, lost in the shadows of ignorance and fear. In an age when family was the only shelter against hunger and violence, a child left without parents was like a leaf torn from its branch. Wars, famines, and pestilence carved deep wounds into households, and in their wake, countless young ones wandered with no hand to guide them. I recall the sight of children barefoot in the mud, their eyes wide with hunger, their voices too hoarse from crying to summon pity. Without kin, they belonged to no hearth, no plough, and no parish. The loss of parents meant the loss of protection, for medieval law was tied to the household. A man's authority covered his kin, but But when he perished, his children fell into a void. Some were absorbed by distant relatives, though this mercy was often strained by scarcity. Others were left to beg at church doors or to follow armies as ragged shadows, scavenging the leftovers of soldiers' camps. The world showed them little mercy, for survival gave no room for weakness. There were few places designed to receive them. Foundling hospitals and organized orphanages were rare, emerging only in later centuries. Before that, monasteries sometimes took in abandoned children, raising them for labor or the cloister. Yet most wandered, becoming beggars at too young an age to understand the cruelty that awaited them. To see a child with outstretched hands was to witness innocence crushed by necessity. Some were pressed into service as servants or farmhands, their youth exploited rather than protected. Masters fed them enough to keep them alive, yet their toil was relentless, often harsher than that of grown men. The weak among them withered, collapsing under tasks their bodies could not endure. I remember a boy of no more than 10, bent beneath a sack of grain, his frame trembling with every step, while his overseer's voice cut sharper than any lash. Others fell into thievery, not by choice, but by hunger's command. Markets were watched for small hands that slipped apples or loaves beneath rags. When caught, punishments were merciless, for even a starving child was judged as a criminal. The stocks or a beating often awaited them, branding them as lawless before they had lived long enough to know the meaning of law. Justice showed no softness for youth in need. Bands of wandering orphans sometimes formed, clinging to one another in shared misery. They roamed the countryside, sleeping in barns or hedgerows, surviving on whatever they could scavenge. Though feared by villagers, they were as much victims as threats, their hunger sharper than their mischief. To the eyes of the settled, they were a reminder of how swiftly fortune could turn, how easily a roof and a meal could be lost. Chroniclers rarely recorded their names, but their presence haunted every age of turmoil. In times of plague especially, the number of children without guardians swelled beyond counting. Some were left standing beside carts of the dead, too small to lift the weight of grief. They stared into mass graves, their innocence buried with their parents, their future darkened before it began. Their silence spoke of abandonment, more bitter than death. When I reflect on these children, I see them as the truest measure of our failures. A world that could not feed or protect its young was a world where survival eclipsed compassion. They carried the heaviest burden upon the smallest shoulders, unseen in records yet etched forever in memory. Their plight remains a wound upon history, for they were the living proof that in the Middle Ages, belonging was as vital as bread, and without it, life itself withered. In a time when every loaf of bread and every measure of grain was counted, the weight of age became a heavy burden. The elderly, once honored for their wisdom, often found themselves powerless when their hands could no longer work the fields or tend the hearth. I remember seeing bent figures seated at the edge of villages, eyes fixed on paths they could no longer walk, their silence filled with quiet resignation. Respect faded quickly when hunger pressed against the door. Households survived only through labor, and those unable to contribute risked becoming mouths without means. Sons and daughters bore the strain of caring for aged parents while tending to their own children, and famine often forced terrible choices. There were stories of old men left behind when villages moved on, their walking too slow for survival's pace. Such tales were not born of cruelty alone, but of desperation sharpened by scarcity. In some communities, care was given for as long as strength allowed. Neighbors might bring food or a warm cloak, yet when famine deepened, even charity withered. The elderly became shadows, surviving on scraps, or on the mercy of monks at the monastery gates. I recall seeing cloister doors open briefly, a crust of bread pass through, and then the portal shut again, sealing comfort within stone walls. Legends spoke of reverence for age, but reality was harsher. A grey head did not always bring respect. Sometimes it marked weakness and dependency. Elders who had once guided fields or led prayers found themselves ignored by the very ones they raised. Memory of past service was not enough to outweigh present hunger. In the harsh rhythm of survival, yesterday's strength meant little when today's toil was unmet. Some wandered into forests or fields, seeking solitude rather than shame. There, they passed quietly, their bones resting beneath the open sky instead of consecrated earth. It was not uncommon for villagers to find such remains come spring, long after snow had concealed them. These lonely deaths were not spoken of often, for they reflected the frailty of a society that preached honor but practiced necessity. The church urged care for one's parents, reminding all of the commandment to honor father and mother. Yet the church itself could not feed every empty stomach. Sermons rang with duty, but bellies demanded action. Monasteries offered refuge for some, but even they could not take all, and many elderly lingered outside cloister walls until hunger or cold claimed them. Even in castles, the aged who had once served as retainers or soldiers could be cast aside. A knight too stiff to mount a horse, or a steward whose memory faltered, found little security once his usefulness ended. Titles and loyalty did not guarantee care, for lords too counted costs when scarcity pressed hard. The fragility of old age spared none, whether serf or noble. What I carry in memory are not the deaths themselves, but the silence that followed. Villages seldom marked the passing of the aged who slipped away unseen. Their absence was accepted as the natural course of things, though I could not help but feel it as a wound upon the soul. In abandoning the old, we abandoned memory itself, severing ties to wisdom that could no longer speak. In the courts of the Middle Ages, punishment was often swifter than understanding. To steal a loaf of bread or a piece of cloth could bring exile, branding, or mutilation. Justice was less about reform and more about warning others of the cost of transgression. I saw men forced from the walls of their own villages, their foreheads scarred with hot iron, so that no community would mistake them for honest folk again. To live marked in this way was to live as a ghost among the living. Exile was a sentence heavier than many prisons. Those driven out carried nothing but their shame and whatever scraps they could hide in their garments. Without land, they had no way to sow or harvest. Without kin, they had no safety. Woods and mountains became their homes, places where law's reach grew thin. I once encountered a man on the road who bore the branded hand of a thief. He smiled faintly, but his eyes betrayed hunger and despair. Communities feared such men and women, for to welcome them was to share in their guilt. Law decreed that those aiding outlaws could face punishment themselves, and so doors stayed shut even when compassion stirred within. The branded wandered between villages like shadows, often chased off by guards or dogs. Many starved before winter ended, their bones lost in thickets where no priest came to bless them. Punishments were designed to erase belonging. A thief's ear cut away, an adulterer paraded in shame, a forger's hand struck off. Such mutilations ensured all would know their sin. I once saw a woman forced to carry a stone through town as penance for her offense, the crowd jeering as though cruelty could cleanse the village. These marks were as enduring as chains, binding the condemned to lives without community. Some turned to outlaw bands, seeking survival in company rather than isolation. Forests grew thick with such groups, men once farmers or craftsmen now living by ambush and theft. Ballads later painted them as rebels, but in truth, most were simply desperate souls clinging to life beyond the walls. Few grew old, for the sheriff's men hunted them with bows and nooses. Death came quickly, and dishonor followed them into the grave. Not all crimes were born of malice. Hunger, poverty, and misfortune often lay at the root, yet the law rarely weighed such matters. To the authorities, order mattered more than mercy, and so the outcasts multiplied. They were the embodiment of society's refusal to bear what it did not understand or could not forgive. In their suffering, one sees not only crime, but the harsh boundaries of communal survival. The church sometimes interceded, urging repentance and offering sanctuary within holy walls. A fugitive who reached the altar could claim temporary protection, though even this mercy had limits. After 40 days, he was forced to leave, carrying a cross as a sign, and often meeting death soon after. Sanctuary gave a breath of hope, but never a lasting place in the world. What lingers in memory is the loneliness etched into their faces. Cast out not only by law, but by neighbours who once shared their bread, they walked roads where no one called their names. Exile was more than distance. It was the erasure of belonging. And so, in the Middle Ages, the criminal was not only punished in body, but abandoned in spirit, condemned to die as one unseen. In a world where the church bound heaven to earth, to be named a heretic was to be torn from both realms at once. The accusation did not fall lightly, for it meant exclusion from the sacraments, from family ties, and often from life itself. I recall the faces of those whispered about in marketplaces, their neighbours crossing themselves as they passed. They were treated as poison, their words dangerous, even when spoken in whispers of prayer. The Cathars of Languedoc come often to my thoughts. They preached simplicity, rejecting the wealth of bishops and the grandeur of cathedrals. For this, armies were sent to root them out, not only soldiers, but inquisitors bearing questions sharper than swords. Towns that once thrived with trade and music were reduced to ashes, their people scattered or slain. To belong to such a faith was to sign one's own sentence of exclusion. The Waldensians, too, with their preaching of poverty and lay devotion, were cast beyond the pale of safety. Men and women who sought only to live humbly by the Gospels found themselves branded as enemies of the Church. Their followers were forced into valleys and mountains, clinging to faith in exile. I walked once through such a village, where hymns rose softly at night, sung with both reverence and fear of discovery. Heresy was not only a private matter, it touched families with equal cruelty. To be kin to a condemned soul was to share in their shame. Wives and children of the accused were shunned, their fields untended, their names whispered as though cursed. Some even changed their names, hoping to sever ties that had become dangerous. Thus, the fire of persecution burned not only individuals, but entire lineages. The punishment for heresy was designed to erase presence entirely. Public burnings left not just bodies consumed, but reputations obliterated. The Church believed such flames purified both the soul and the community, though I saw only smoke rising like a plea that heaven did not answer. The ashes were scattered, denied burial in consecrated ground, as though even death could not restore dignity. For many, silence was the only defense. Men buried books, women prayed in secret, children learned to mask their heritage behind outward obedience. Entire villages lived two lives, one for the world and another for God, as they understood Him. Yet even silence was dangerous, for inquisitors searched for hesitation in speech, for tremors in faith, and for the faintest sign of doubt. And still, some stood firm. They met their trials with voices steady, proclaiming their beliefs though they knew the cost. I remember hearing of one who sang hymns while flames rose about him, his voice breaking only when smoke stole his breath. Such defiance was rare, but it burned in memory brighter than the torches of his accusers. Faith could be crushed in body, yet not always in spirit. Looking back, I see heresy less as rebellion, and more as the cry of souls seeking truth in a time of rigid power. Those cast out by faith remind me how fragile belonging can be, and how swiftly trust can turn to condemnation. Their fate was not only death, but the erasure of memory, a silence imposed by fear, broken only when we dare to recall them. Medieval life left little space for women who stood outside the protection of men. A widow without sons or brothers to defend her often found herself at the mercy of lords or creditors. Land and inheritance laws seldom favoured her, and she could be dispossessed in an instant. I recall seeing widows turned from their homes, their dowries consumed, their fields claimed by distant relatives. They clutched rosaries as they wept, Yet prayers did not soften the hunger waiting at the door. For those who sold their bodies, survival came at the cost of reputation. Prostitution, though condemned, was also tolerated as a necessary vice in many towns. Brothels were sometimes regulated by councils, their profits feeding the very coffers that scorned the women within. I saw such women once, standing beneath lanterns at dusk, their faces weary, their dignity traded for bread. Society used them and then cast them aside, their names forever shadowed by shame. Accusations of witchcraft cut deeper still. Women who knew herbs, or who lived alone on the edge of villages, became easy targets for suspicion. A failed harvest or sudden illness could bring blame upon their heads. Fear clothed them in falsehood, and rumor became a sentence stronger than any chain. I recall a healer dragged before a crowd, her hands trembling not from guilt, but from the cold certainty of her fate. Without male guardianship, the law offered little shield. A woman's word weighed less in courts, her rights bound to the authority of father, husband, or son. Those who strayed beyond these bounds became vulnerable to exploitation, their silence purchased with threats or hunger. Even those who worked honestly as washerwomen, midwives, or spinners lived under suspicion, for labor did not erase their marginal place. Monasteries sometimes offered refuge. Convents took in women abandoned or accused, granting them a cloistered safety at the cost of freedom. Within stone walls, they found prayer, discipline, and a measure of protection. Yet even there, many were not willing pilgrims, but driven by necessity, their vows less of devotion than of survival. The cloister was haven and prison alike, closing doors that the outside world had already slammed shut. Some gained influence despite these chains. Noble widows who managed estates or queens who ruled as regents showed the strength women could wield when law allowed. Yet for every Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile, there were countless nameless women who bore the weight of poverty, rumor, and exclusion. History remembers the few, while the many remain voiceless beneath the dust. Daily life for those on the margins was a constant negotiation. A kind word from a priest, a coin from a merchant, or the pity of neighbors could mean the difference between life and despair. Yet each act of mercy was fleeting, and suspicion always lingered. Their worth was measured not by their humanity, but by their alignment with a rigid order that left little room for the vulnerable. When I think of them now, it is their silence that troubles me most. These women were not rare exceptions, but ever-present figures, woven into every village and town. Yet they lived and died without record, their struggles hidden beneath the noise of kings and battles. Their marginalization is a wound in history's fabric, one that reminds us how power often turned a blind eye to the dignity of half its people. Hunger was the most relentless enemy of the Middle Ages, striking without banners or warning horns. When crops failed through flood, frost, or drought, entire regions sank into despair. The granaries emptied quickly, and the price of bread soared beyond the reach of common folk. I recall lines of villagers waiting before a baker's stall, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling with the weight of coins too few for what was needed. Hope often withered as fast as the harvest itself. The Great Famine of 1315 lingers in memory as one of the darkest seasons. Rain fell without ceasing, rotting grain in the fields and drowning cattle in mud. Men dug up roots and bark, women boiled weeds, and children gnawed at scraps that carried no nourishment. The chronicles spoke of parents forced to abandon infants by the roadside, their cries fading into silence as fields lay barren. Even in monasteries, where storehouses offered some relief, the supply ran thin. Scarcity divided communities between those deemed useful and those considered a burden. Able-bodied workers were fed first, their labor seen as the lifeline of survival. The weak, the sick, the elderly, and the very young were often left behind when food grew scarce. I saw it once in a village where a father carried grain to his eldest son while his frail mother sat unattended in the shadows, her lips parched, her eyes resigned. Migration was sometimes the only chance, though the road brought as much peril as hope. Families abandoned homes, carrying bundles of rags and pots, seeking rumored lands of plenty. Yet many never reached such places, falling instead by ditches or in forests where no bread awaited them. Abandoned cottages dotted the countryside, their hearths cold, their walls sagging as though mourning the lives that once filled them. Those who survived famine bore scars long after. Stunted growth, weakened bodies, and memories of hunger shaped entire generations. It is said that people turned suspicious and guarded, hoarding grain in secret when fortune returned, fearing the cycle would strike again. Trust itself became scarce, for hunger taught men to look first to their own hearth, even if it meant another's fire went cold. In the darkest accounts, there are whispers of cannibalism, of despair so complete that men and women turned against nature itself. Chroniclers describe desperate souls digging into graves or feeding upon the weakest. Though rare, such stories reveal the depths to which famine could drive humanity. They remind us how thin the line is between survival and ruin when the fields yield nothing. The church preached that famine was a punishment from God, urging repentance and processions. Villagers walked barefoot, chanting prayers, seeking to turn divine wrath into mercy. Yet prayers did not fill stomachs, and many lost faith as swiftly as they lost strength. When the priest's chalice held wine while children fainted from hunger, the contrast wounded more deeply than hunger alone. When I remember famine, I do not think only of empty fields, but of the silence it spread. The laughter of children grew faint, songs of labor ceased, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer fell quiet. Villages sank into stillness, broken only by the sound of wind through barren branches. Hunger stripped away not just life, but the very rhythm of community, leaving behind echoes of loss that no feast could ever erase. In later centuries of the Middle Ages, a strange contrivance began to appear in certain towns. The foundling wheel. Built into the walls of monasteries or hospitals, it allowed an unwanted child to be placed upon a wooden turntable and rotated inside, away from the gaze of the mother who left it there. I once saw such a wheel in Florence, its wood darkened by use, the cries of infants echoing faintly from within. It was a device born of sorrow, offering safety through secrecy. Mothers who came to the wheel were often driven by desperation, not cruelty. Poverty, dishonor, or the death of a husband left them unable to provide. To bear an illegitimate child was to risk ruin, for the stain of scandal clung fiercely in those times. The wheel offered a way to save the infant's life without revealing the mother's name, protecting both from the harsh judgment of the world. It was a mercy shaped by shame. The infants received were given over to wet nurses, sometimes hired by the institutions, sometimes women from the countryside who took them for a small payment. Yet survival was uncertain. Many children perished from neglect, poor nourishment, or illness. The registers of these hospitals bear witness to countless small lives extinguished before their first steps. For every child who lived, many others faded quietly, their names never known beyond the scribbled notes of clerks. And yet, the wheel was also a lifeline. It gave the helpless a chance that the roadside could not. Some who grew within monastery care became servants, craftsmen, or even priests. A few rose to notable ranks, though always carrying the unspoken mark of abandonment. Their lives remind us that even in the harshest systems, mercy could carve a fragile path where none seemed possible. These institutions varied greatly in their compassion. Some monasteries saw the care of foundlings as holy duty, pouring resources into their survival. Others used them as laborers, their existence tolerated more than cherished. I once passed through a town where the wheel turned nightly, the cries of infants so common that villagers ceased to remark upon them. What should have stirred hearts became routine, a reminder of how often despair visited the poor. The very presence of such wheels revealed the limits of family and community bonds. They testified to the despair of mothers who could not raise their children, and to the failure of societies that left them so alone. In giving up their infants, these women entrusted strangers with the lives they longed to keep, forced by poverty or dishonor to make an unthinkable choice. It was survival at the cost of heartbreak. Even the church, though offering this system, spoke with conflicting voices. On one hand, it condemned abandonment as sin. On the other, it blessed the wheels as a shield for the innocent. Sermons urged charity for the foundlings, yet gossip still haunted the mothers who placed them there. Thus, mercy and judgment walked side by side, leaving no heart untouched by contradiction. When I recall those wheels, I do not think only of wood and iron, but of the hands that placed infants upon them in the stillness of night. Each creak of the turning spoke of despair, but also of love enough to seek a chance for survival. In their quiet revolutions, the wheels turned not just children into wards of the church, but sorrow into silence, a silence that echoes still through history. Those who wandered from one parish to another lived under suspicion, for movement itself was mistrusted in the Middle Ages. A man without roots, without family or fixed dwelling, was often seen as a danger. Villages relied upon bonds of kinship to judge character, and strangers carried no such proof. I recall guards at the gates of towns questioning travelers with stern eyes, their words sharp, even when no crime had been done. To walk without ties was to walk under a shadow. Many sought the road not from choice but from hunger or exile. Failed harvests, loss of land, or the cruelty of lords drove men and women to wander. They followed rumours of work or alms, only to meet rejection at every new threshold. Inns charged coin they did not have, and barns were locked against them. I have seen such figures curled beneath hedges, their sleep broken by the cold or by dogs set upon them. The church urged kindness to pilgrims, yet the line between pilgrim and vagrant was easily blurred. Those who bore tokens or badges of holy journeys might find bread and shelter, while others without proof were driven away. Suspicion marked their steps, and charity grew thin where fear of thieves lingered. I once saw a man claim to be bound for Santiago, yet his torn shoes and hollow face betrayed more hunger than devotion. Laws tightened against the wandering poor. Councils issued decrees that vagrants should be whipped, branded, or expelled. To settle without permission risked punishment, for communities feared theft more than they feared hunger. The road thus became a cycle of rejection, each step leading not to safety, but to another locked gate. Those who lived this way carried not only fatigue, but the bitterness of endless suspicion. Women bore this burden doubly. A lone woman on the road was judged harshly, assumed to be a prostitute or a thief. Many were assaulted, their suffering unspoken, for no parish claimed them. Children, too, following parents or left to fend for themselves, were easy prey. Their presence stirred pity in some, yet more often, fear of contagion or theft silenced compassion. The road was rarely kind to the weak. There were times when wanderers formed small groups, finding protection in numbers. Yet even then, they were branded as threats, their gatherings seen as the seed of rebellion or crime. Outlawry and vagrancy became entwined in the minds of rulers, making every band of poor travelers suspect. I remember passing such a group in the woods, their fire hidden, their eyes wide as they watched me ride by, as if expecting to be hunted. The irony was bitter. Lords and kings themselves demanded movement during wars and pilgrimages. Armies marched across fields, merchants carried goods along roads, and crusaders traversed continents. Yet when the poor moved in search of survival, they were scorned. Their wandering was seen not as duty or trade, but as failure, a reminder that society's safety net was woven with holes too wide to mend. When I dwell upon their fate, it is the endlessness of the road that stays with me. To wander without welcome was to live in exile everywhere, belonging nowhere. Each step carried not hope, but uncertainty. Each dawn the same hunger, each night the same suspicion. The poor traveller was not only hungry in body, but homeless in spirit, condemned to a life of motion that led to no destination. Beyond the gates of many medieval towns lay grim places where justice was displayed for all to see. Gallows stood high on hills, their beams darkened by weather and by the weight of countless bodies. I remember riding past such places, the wind carrying the creak of rope and the distant cry of crows. The dead hung there not for burial, but for warning, their silence meant to teach obedience. It was a punishment that lingered long after breath had fled. Those condemned to die were not granted the dignity of consecrated ground. Their bodies were denied church rites, for sin was thought to cling even to their bones. Instead, they were left exposed, carrion for birds and beasts. I once saw a skull at the foot of a gibbet, gnawed by dogs, the jaw half buried in mud. Such sights were meant to terrify, yet they revealed more about fear's cruelty than about justice. The execution grounds were not only places of death, but of spectacle. Crowds gathered to witness hangings or beheadings, as though death were a form of theatre. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, men jeered, women wept, and priests prayed. The condemned often spoke final words, begging forgiveness or cursing their accusers. Those words drifted on the wind, forgotten by the crowd as quickly as the body was raised. Criminals were not the only ones who met such ends. Rebels, heretics, and even innocents accused without proof found themselves upon the gallows. In the eyes of authority, their death served the same purpose, to maintain order through fear. The executioner's hand was steady, for he was both feared and needed, carrying out society's harshest sentence. Yet once the rope was tied, the memory of the condemned was swiftly erased. Those who dared retrieve the bodies did so in secret, risking punishment. Families sometimes crept to the fields at night, carrying their loved ones to hidden graves. Most, however, could not. Poverty, shame, or fear left them powerless, and so the dead remained hanging, their bones whitening in the sun. Their fate was not only death, but the loss of remembrance, their names fading with the seasons. In some regions, gallows were built so tall that they could be seen from miles away. They stood as wooden crosses of warning, reminders that sin and crime led to disgrace. Travelers passed by and made the sign of the cross, whispering prayers not for the condemned but for themselves. The land itself seemed scarred by their presence, fields blighted by the memory of death. The church often spoke of justice and repentance, yet the denial of burial revealed a harsher truth. Mercy was reserved for the living, not for those condemned. Even in death, punishment continued, extending beyond the grave. To be denied the resting place of consecrated earth was to be cast out from the community of both men and saints. It was exile made eternal. When I recall these grounds, I see not only the bodies, but the indifference that surrounded them. Life went on in the villages. Markets bustled and bells rang, while the forgotten dead swayed in the wind. They were erased twice, once by death and again by neglect. Their silence lingers still, a reminder of how justice in those days often sought not fairness, but fear, leaving behind bones that no one claimed. Along the outskirts of towns, far from the bustle of markets and the ring of church bells, stood the leprosaria. These institutions bore the name of charity, yet within their stone walls, those afflicted with leprosy lived lives of confinement. I once passed one on a journey near Rouen, its tall walls rising like a fortress, though its prisoners carried no swords. Their only crime was the sickness that clung to their flesh. Inside, life followed a rhythm of exile. The sick prayed in chapels apart from the healthy, ate in refectories apart from monks, and walked in gardens bordered by stone. Even their graves were set aside, marked by simple crosses far from the parish cemetery. It was as though they had been erased from the community, yet still permitted to breathe within the narrow bounds allowed to them. Their voices never rose above the walls. Charity was offered, but it came with conditions. Food, clothing, and shelter were provided, yet freedom was taken away. Once admitted, many never left, living the remainder of their days among fellow sufferers. Families visited rarely, if at all, leaving tokens of remembrance at the gates. I recall seeing a child press bread through the iron bars to her mother, her hand trembling before being pulled away by fearful kin. Though some houses were founded by kings and bishops, they often became overcrowded and under-provisioned. Resources dwindled quickly, and those inside bore hunger alongside disease. Their infirmity was compounded by poverty, and the institutions reflected more fear than compassion. The walls protected society, not the sufferers, for they were designed to contain what was dreaded rather than to heal. Still, within those walls, a form of community endured. Lepers supported one another, sharing what little comfort they could. They tended to each other's sores, sang hymns softly in chapels, and buried their dead with reverence when no priest came. Their brotherhood in suffering was a fragile defiance against the world's rejection, a reminder that humanity could still survive where dignity was denied. Priests and nuns sometimes served in these houses, though even they often kept distance. Their prayers echoed through corridors, their blessings spoken at arm's length. Yet there were a few who touched the sick, who risked closeness in the name of Christ. Such figures were rare lights in a dark system, though their deeds seldom erased the deeper truth. These were places of exclusion, not restoration. In many towns, the leprosarium lay close to crossroads, so that travelers might see and remember the wages of sin or contagion. The sick were put on display even in their isolation, their presence a living sermon of fear. To pass by such a place was to feel the chill of mortality, for the walls whispered what fate might await anyone should fortune turn cruel. When I call them to mind, I see the leprosaria not as sanctuaries, but as boundaries. They offered survival, but at the cost of freedom, identity, and belonging. Within their walls, men and women waited for death, already cut off from life outside. They were not forgotten entirely, but remembered only as warnings. And in that, their suffering was made heavier than disease itself. Among the many paradoxes of medieval life was the difference between chosen poverty and imposed poverty. The mendicant orders, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, embraced lives without possessions, walking barefoot through towns, dependent on the alms of others. Their poverty was called holy, and their empty hands were seen as symbols of devotion. I remember watching a group of friars sing as they entered a village, their voices humble yet commanding reverence. Their hunger was sanctified by the name of God. Yet at the same time, those who begged out of necessity were scorned. Common beggars, often no different in their rags from the friars, were treated as burdens rather than saints. The difference lay not in the state of their bellies, but in the authority of the church that cloaked the monks in legitimacy. I once saw a beggar driven off with curses, while a friar beside him received a loaf of bread with bowed head and blessing. The Franciscans preached humility, living among the poor and sometimes blurring the line between holy vow and true destitution. Their presence softened hearts, encouraging almsgiving that might otherwise have been withheld. Yet this contrast also sharpened resentment among the needy, who saw monks clothed in habit, yet secure in the protection of an order, while they themselves faced stocks and whips for the same act of asking. Survival became a matter not only of need, but of title. Dominicans, in their black cloaks, sought not only alms, but also authority in preaching. Their words carried weight, and their hunger was framed as spiritual discipline. Theirs was a respected poverty, a chosen path leading to influence within the very structure of the church. Meanwhile, the poor man at the cathedral door, muttering for bread, was dismissed as idle or sinful. To be holy in rags was acceptable. To be desperate in rags was a crime. In towns, the presence of mendicants changed the rhythm of giving. Alms that might have gone to the local poor were redirected to friars, whose prayers promised salvation for the donor's soul. The poor resented this silent theft, yet had no voice to protest. I remember hearing a beggar whisper bitterly that the habit on a man's back was worth more than his hunger. His truth was sharp, though it echoed into nothing. The mendicant orders did bring learning and preaching, and for that many were grateful. They moved among the people, teaching, comforting, and reminding all of God's mercy. But their poverty, though real, was buffered by community and faith, while the poverty of the beggar at the roadside was solitary and condemned. This hypocrisy cut deeply, revealing how society cloaked its fears beneath piety. Some friars themselves lamented this contradiction. Writings from within their ranks tell of unease, of brothers who feared that their order's poverty had become too honored, too safe. They saw the suffering of true beggars and wondered whether their own path had lost its edge. I recall hearing a friar preach on the market steps, his voice trembling as he urged compassion not only for monks, but for the nameless poor who starved beyond the walls. The memory of these contrasts still unsettles me. To walk barefoot by choice was called holy. To walk barefoot by fate was called shame. Both suffered hunger, yet only one was blessed. In this lies a truth about the Middle Ages, that dignity was not tied to suffering itself, but to the name and power under which it was endured. And for the forgotten poor, no such cloak of sanctity was ever granted. Marriage in medieval Europe was bound by sacrament, yet beneath the church's solemn vows, harsh realities often prevailed. A woman without her husband's favor could find herself discarded, her security slipping away like water through open fingers. Annulments, though cloaked in legality, stripped wives of status and shelter. I once heard a priest proclaim the sanctity of matrimony while outside. A woman wept, driven from her home after her husband sought freedom through influence. Sanctity bowed to power, and the wife bore the weight of rejection. Desertion was more common than official annulment, for not all men had the coin or influence to appeal to bishops. Some husbands simply vanished, leaving wives to fend for themselves, their fate uncertain. A deserted woman had no claim to property, no voice in courts, and little chance of remarriage. She became a widow in life, yet without the sympathy granted to true widows. I saw such women wandering with children clinging to their skirts, their eyes hollow with shame and want. The cloister often became the refuge of the abandoned. Families or husbands placed women into convents, sometimes against their will, declaring it an act of piety. Behind convent walls, these wives exchanged one form of bondage for another, trading the household for the cloister. Though some found solace in prayer, many lived their days in resignation, their vows less chosen than imposed. The church spoke of devotion, they felt only confinement. For those without the protection of a convent, survival was harder still. Many slipped into poverty, forced into begging or labor, for which society held little respect. A few turned to prostitution, not from choice, but from lack of alternatives. The scorn they endured was double, first cast aside by their husbands, then condemned for the very means by which they kept themselves alive. Their stories seldom reached parchment, yet their suffering was no less real. Even noble women, with lands and dowries, were not safe. Political alliances shifted, and a wife once cherished could become an obstacle. Some were set aside under claims of infertility or kinship too close, excuses made to satisfy ambition. Queens and ladies cloaked in silk still knew the taste of abandonment, though their fall carried more whispers than public shame. Their plight reveals how fragile even high station could be when loyalty faltered. The law itself rarely defended the cast-off wife. Courts often sided with husbands, especially when wealth or influence was at stake. Appeals to bishops could take years, and outcomes favored men more often than women. I once heard a story of a woman who sought justice from the bishop's court, only to be told that her duty was obedience, even to a man who had deserted her. Her tears fell unheard into the dust of the cathedral floor. Children of abandoned wives bore the burden as well. Stripped of inheritance or legitimacy, they often became wanderers, their future marked by their parents' fractured union. The mother's shame stained them as surely as poverty did. I saw boys of such lineage enter towns seeking work, only to be rejected once their origins became known. The stain of abandonment clung across generations. When I reflect on these women, it is not only their suffering that lingers, but their invisibility. Cast aside, They vanished from records, from family memory, and from the security of belonging. Their fate was to slip into silence, erased by law, by church, and by time itself. To be abandoned as a wife in the Middle Ages was to be left not only without bread or home, but without identity, a ghost while yet alive. Bound to the soil, serfs lived lives tethered not by choice but by obligation. Their labor was the heartbeat of medieval estates, yet their freedom was as scarce as coin in their hands. A serf unable to meet the demands of his lord risked losing even the meager protection of his hut and plot. I remember fields where men bent their backs from dawn until dusk, their sweat soaking into soil that would never belong to them. Their worth was measured in harvests, not in humanity. To fail in those duties was perilous. A bad season, an injury, or simple misfortune could leave a serf unable to deliver rents or labor. Lords showed little mercy in such cases, for survival of their estates outweighed compassion. I once heard of a man who, unable to meet his dues, was turned out with his family, their cottage given to another. They became wanderers, stripped of the only security they had ever known. Some fled, seeking freedom in towns where labor guilds and charters promised a new life. But capture awaited those who failed to secure protection. Runaway serfs were pursued, their names carried by word of mouth across parishes. If caught, they were dragged back in chains, their flight punished as betrayal. Freedom, though possible, was often a dream that ended in harsher bondage. I recall the hollow look in the eyes of one such man, branded for daring to hope. The church, while preaching dignity of labor, seldom challenged the system. Priests reminded serfs that their place in the hierarchy was ordained, their toil a form of penance. Heaven, they were told, would reward patience in this life of hardship. But such promises offered little warmth against the cold reality of hunger and oppression. Their prayers rose from fields, mingling with the cries of crows circling overhead. Even within the village, the weakest among serfs were most vulnerable. Those unable to plough or reap, the old, the injured, the widowed, often slipped into poverty. Without the Lord's tolerance, they were cast adrift, becoming beggars at church doors. I remember an old man who had once worked proudly in the fields. When he could no longer lift the scythe, his lord ignored him, and he faded into silence, his years forgotten like fallen straw. Occasionally revolts erupted when burdens grew unbearable. Serfs in Flanders, England, and elsewhere rose in anger, demanding relief from taxes and dues. Yet such uprisings were crushed with blood and fire, their leaders executed as examples. Those who survived returned to their ploughs, their hope beaten down by steel. The fields bore witness to their courage, even as history seldom recorded their names. The fragility of their position revealed the narrow line between belonging and exile. To work was to survive, to falter was to vanish. Their homes were not their own, their labor not fully theirs, their lives held in the balance of a Lord's will. Though they formed the largest part of society, they remained voiceless, their struggles hidden beneath the records of kings and nobles. When I think upon the serfs, I do not see faceless laborers but men and women whose endurance carried kingdoms upon their shoulders. Yet when strength failed, they were abandoned, their existence erased as if they had never ploughed or planted. Forgotten in life and often in death, they stand as a reminder that the might of medieval lords was built upon the fragile backs of those who had no choice but to serve. Battlefields consumed the strong, but they also cast aside those broken by combat. When soldiers returned with missing limbs, blinded eyes, or shattered strength, their service often ended not with honor, but with abandonment. Lords required men who could still bear arms, not those who bore scars. I remember companions who had once stood proudly at my side, later reduced to hobbling figures outside town gates, begging for bread with the same hands that once held swords. Veterans found no system of care to ease their decline. There were no pensions, no hospitals devoted to those maimed in service, only the charity of kin or the mercy of strangers. Some sought arms by showing their wounds, proof of battles fought for lords who now ignored them. Yet the sight of such suffering stirred more discomfort than gratitude, and coins were few. A scar that once spoke of bravery became instead a mark of burden. Knights dismissed their squires when injury struck, and kings seldom remembered the footmen who bled in their wars. Chronicles praised victories and listed the names of nobles, but the countless wounded remained nameless. Their pain dissolved into silence, their sacrifices forgotten as swiftly as the battle smoke cleared. I once met a man who had lost his leg in service to his lord. His name was never recorded, yet his suffering endured until his last breath. War itself showed no pity for those left behind. When armies moved on, the wounded who could not follow were often abandoned on the field. Some crawled to villages seeking aid, only to be turned away out of fear or famine. Others lay among the dead, their cries fading into the night, ignored by both friend and foe. I cannot forget the sound of those voices, carried on the wind long after the clash had ended. Monasteries sometimes took in the maimed, offering bread and a bed of straw. Yet even there, these men were more mouths to feed than laborers to rely upon. Their days became slow, their bodies reminders of war's cruelty, their presence tolerated but seldom honored. They survived, but survival without purpose weighed heavily. To live without belonging is to live half a life, and many withered in cloisters, forgotten by the lords who had once summoned them. The poor among the wounded fared worst. Without coin for ransom, captured soldiers were enslaved, executed, or left to die in pits. Only nobles could hope for release through wealth, while common men were expendable. Their loyalty on the battlefield was purchased with promises that dissolved in the face of loss. I often wonder how many nameless graves across Europe hold the bones of men who once swore fealty, only to be cast aside. Families bore the burden when soldiers returned broken. A crippled father could not till the soil, a blinded son could not guard the flock. Hunger spread quickly in such homes, and resentment followed. Some families cared for their wounded with devotion, others turned cold, unable to sustain the weight of one who could no longer provide. War did not end when swords were sheathed. It lingered in the silent despair of those who limped home. When memory brings these men before me, I see not the glory of banners, but the hollow stares of the discarded. They gave their youth to kings and their strength to battles, only to find themselves cast into the shadows once their bodies failed. Their suffering was the unspoken cost of war, a debt rarely paid. In their fate lies a lesson. The price of victory was written not only in the blood spilled, but in the silence that followed. Forests and mountains became the last refuge for those driven from villages, branded by law or broken by hunger. In those wild places, outcasts formed bands, not out of choice, but out of necessity. I remember hearing their fires crackle in the distance, hidden beneath the canopy, the glow faint, but defiant. They were called thieves and killers, yet many had once been farmers, serfs, or soldiers who found no place within the walls of their communities. Their lives were harsh, for the wilderness offered no certainty. They hunted game, stole from passing merchants, and ambushed travelers on lonely roads. Such deeds fed the name of outlaw, but behind them lay desperation more than malice. Some carried scars from battles lost, others bore the mark of exile upon their bodies. Together they forged a brotherhood of survival, bound by hunger and fear of capture. Authorities painted them as demons of the woods, using their stories to frighten the obedient. Children were warned to behave lest the outlaws carry them away, and lords issued decrees to root them out. I recall a proclamation nailed to a church door, promising reward for the heads of band leaders. Their names were spoken with contempt in towns, but with a hint of awe among the poor, who sometimes saw them as symbols of defiance. Not all who lived in these bands were men. Some women joined them, having been cast aside or fleeing accusations. They shared the same dangers, living by theft and hiding from patrols. Their presence added both burden and strength, for they too had been rejected by the world beyond the forest edge. Children born into such lives grew up without memory of hearth or parish, belonging only to the shadows of trees. Hunger was their constant companion. Food was never certain, and betrayal could be as deadly as the sheriff's sword. Outlaws trusted only one another, for to trust outsiders was to risk the noose. I recall a captured man once paraded through a town, his body broken from torture, his silence unbroken despite threats. Loyalty was their shield, though it often ended at the gallows. The end for most was violent. Soldiers hunted them, sheriffs tracked them, and traps were laid in the forests. Few reached old age, most fell by blade or rope. Their bodies were displayed as warnings, their deaths another layer of fear added to their name. Yet even so, the bands reformed, for new outcasts always replaced the fallen. The cycle of rejection fed the life of the woods endlessly. Ballads later romanticized them, turning some into heroes who robbed the rich to feed the poor. But the truth was far starker. Hunger, exile, and desperation carved their existence. They were not figures of legend but of sorrow, men and women forced into lawlessness by a world that offered no other path. The songs remembered them kindly, but the fields remembered their absence more truthfully. When I think of these bands, I see not rebels, but souls stripped of belonging. The outlaw's life was born not of choice, but of rejection, a final refuge in a society that had no room for them. They remind me that law in those times did not always mean justice, and that survival often carried the mark of sin. In their wandering shadows, the story of abandonment took its fiercest form. Though leprosy cast the longest shadow, it was not the only affliction that tore through medieval lives. Illnesses such as smallpox, tuberculosis, and ergotism stalked both rich and poor alike. I recall villages where children bore the scars of pox upon their faces, their beauty marred, their health forever weakened. Tuberculosis hollowed lungs and silenced voices, its slow grip leaving men and women wasted shells of themselves. These diseases were not feared merely for their pain, but for the stigma they brought. Ergotism, the fire of St. Anthony, struck in terrible waves. Rye tainted by fungus filled the stomachs of the poor, bringing convulsions, gangrene, and visions that many mistook for madness or possession. I once saw a man lose his foot, blackened and brittle, while his neighbours whispered of sin. Pilgrimages to shrines offered the only hope, and those afflicted crowded in search of miracles that seldom came. Their suffering revealed how hunger itself could become poison. Smallpox, with its fever and pustules, spread swiftly through households. Survivors often carried deep scars, their faces marked for life, and some were blinded. Children were especially vulnerable, their cries echoing through shuttered homes. Few treatments existed, only herbs and prayers, and those who lived did so scarred both in body and in spirit. The disease left reminders long after it passed, as if memory itself were carved into the skin. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, wasted its victims slowly, the cough persistent, the body wasting away despite every effort to nourish it. Families sometimes abandoned sufferers out of fear, though the disease lingered quietly rather than striking suddenly. I met a young man once who had been left to die in a barn, his ribs pressing against his skin, his breath shallow as a whisper. His crime was simply to sicken too long. Blame fell often upon the afflicted, for ignorance turned pity into judgment. Illness was seen as punishment for sin, a sign of God's displeasure. Those who suffered were not only weakened but condemned, treated as though their malady was of their own making. This belief added weight to their misery, for they carried both pain and shame. To be sick was to be accused as much as to be afflicted. Communities preferred distance over care. The sick were hidden away, sometimes forced into huts at the edges of villages, their meals left at the door. Even family ties could snap under fear. I remember a mother who dared not embrace her fevered child, weeping as she watched from across the threshold. Her love was strong, but fear of contagion was stronger still, binding her arms. Monasteries sometimes took in the diseased, but their means were limited. They offered herbs, baths, or prayers, yet they could not halt the spread. Pilgrimages to shrines dedicated to healing saints became common, with long lines of sufferers begging for divine relief. Some claimed visions or cures, but for most, the journey ended in disappointment. Hope became another burden, heavy upon the sick who could barely stand. These diseases left behind more than bodies. They reshaped memory and community. Entire villages carried the scars of outbreaks. Their numbers diminished, their trust weakened. Fear silenced compassion, leaving the sick to fade in solitude. When I think of them now, I do not see only illness, but the loneliness it carried, the turning away of hands and hearts, leaving men and women to die not only in pain, but in abandonment. Among the deepest wounds of medieval Europe was the treatment of Jews and other minorities. Entire communities that had lived for centuries in towns and cities were uprooted by decree, their homes seized, their synagogues destroyed. I recall hearing of York in 1190, where Jews sought refuge in a tower, only to face massacre at the hands of a mob. Such moments were not rare, but repeated, carried by tides of fear, envy, and false piety. Persecution often wore the mask of religion. Accusations of ritual crimes or host desecrations spread like wildfire, though no proof ever existed. During Holy Week or times of famine, Jews were often blamed for Christ's suffering or for calamities striking the land. Crowds, incited by preachers, turned suspicion into violence. I once saw a Jewish man driven from the market by stones, his wares scattered, while authorities looked away. His silence told of centuries of endured injustice. Expulsions became tools of kings and lords, both for politics and profit. In England, Edward IV ordered the expulsion of Jews in 1290, seizing their properties to fill royal coffers. France followed similar paths, alternating between welcoming Jewish financiers and casting them out when debts grew inconvenient. These expulsions did not only remove people, but tore the economic fabric of towns, leaving behind both ruin and bitterness. The poor often envied the relative prosperity of Jewish moneylenders, forgetting that laws barred Jews from most other trades. Forced into roles despised yet needed, they became targets of resentment. Their survival depended on a fragile balance, tolerated when useful, destroyed when scapegoats were required. I walked once through a quarter abandoned after an expulsion, its homes boarded, its synagogue desecrated. The silence of those streets felt heavier than any battlefield. Other minorities, too, bore exclusion. Muslims in Spain, after centuries of coexistence under Al-Andalus, faced persecution as Christian kingdoms expanded. Many were forced to convert or live as second-class subjects, their faith marked against them. Even converts, suspected of false devotion, suffered suspicion. Difference itself became a crime, for unity of faith was demanded above the bonds of shared humanity. Pogroms during the plague years revealed the depth of cruelty. As the Black Death spread, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and entire communities were burned alive in towns across Germany and beyond. Fear silenced reason, and desperation sought easy blame. I remember hearing of Mainz, where thousands perished in flames, not from pestilence but from the hands of their neighbors. Such horrors left scars deeper than disease itself. The wandering that followed was endless. Families driven from one land to another carried little but their faith and memory. They crossed borders in search of safety, only to find new edicts and persecutions awaiting them. Their lives became a chain of displacements, their children growing up strangers in every land. To be a minority in those centuries was to live always on the threshold, never fully at home. When I reflect on their fate, I see not only their suffering, but also the loss to the societies that cast them out. Knowledge, trade, music, and wisdom vanished with their departure, leaving emptiness behind. Yet those who expelled them seldom noticed, blinded by fear and greed. The exclusion of minorities was more than cruelty to individuals. It was a wound carved into the very heart of Europe, one that history still remembers with sorrow. In an age when words were prayers, contracts, and commands, those born without hearing or speech were often seen as incomplete. The deaf and mute stood apart, unable to join in chants of the Mass or respond to the calls of labor. I recall a boy in a village who moved his lips soundlessly as the priest intoned the liturgy, his eyes wide with longing to belong. His silence was not his choice, yet it was treated as a barrier to his very humanity. Medieval thought judged their condition harshly. Many believed the deaf and mute incapable of faith, for they could not hear scripture or confess sins aloud. The church often excluded them from sacraments, doubting whether they could truly understand divine mysteries. This spiritual exile weighed as heavily as physical want. To be denied the fullness of worship was to be marked as less than whole in the eyes of God and man. Families, too, bore the burden with unease. Some sheltered their kin, hiding them from scorn, while others treated them as shameful secrets. Without the ability to work fields, speak in markets, or serve in courts, their usefulness was doubted. I once saw a young woman, unable to speak, laboring in silence at a spinning wheel, her skill ignored because she could not voice her worth. Silence was often mistaken for emptiness, though her hands told another truth. Cruelty was common, for what is not understood is easily mocked. Children laughed at their gestures, adults dismissed their efforts, and suspicion followed them as though muteness itself were a sign of sin. In some places, they were thought touched by curses or spirits, feared rather than pitied. Their isolation was not only of sound but of belonging, as if silence cut them adrift from the fabric of community itself. Yet there were places where compassion softened this harshness. Certain monastic communities, devoted to care, attempted to teach simple forms of sign, gestures that allowed the deaf to express basic needs. These efforts were limited, but they revealed a flicker of recognition that silence did not equal ignorance. In rare cases, mute men served as laborers in monasteries, their silence fitting the cloister's stillness. Even so, their dignity remained precarious. Legal rights were often denied to them, for testimony required speech and oaths demanded words. They could not defend themselves in courts or claim inheritance easily. The law treated them as incapable of responsibility, stripping them of agency. I once heard of a man denied his family's land because he could not swear his claim aloud. His silence, though born of nature, was taken as consent to be erased. Some, however, carved out fragile places of survival. They worked in fields where strength of arm mattered more than words, or tended animals whose company required no speech. Their lives were quieter than others, yet still bound to the same cycle of toil and hunger. In their silence, they bore witness to the world's indifference, enduring not only the absence of sound, but the absence of recognition. What remains in my memory is not their inability, but the stillness that surrounded them. Theirs was a silence imposed by society as much as by nature, a double exile from both voice and community. They remind me that words were power in those centuries, and without them, even the strongest spirit was diminished. In their quiet endurance, they carried a dignity few recognized, yet one that still lingers across the centuries. On the fields of battle, capture did not always bring survival. Nobles taken in war could hope for ransom, their wealth and titles granting them value beyond the fight. But for the common soldier, capture was often the beginning of disappearance. I remember watching cartloads of prisoners dragged away after a siege, their eyes hollow, their fate uncertain. Few returned, for they had no coin to buy their freedom, no lord to speak their name. Ransom was a privilege of rank. Knights and lords were exchanged like precious goods, with negotiations drawn out in letters sealed by wax. Their release enriched captors and preserved honor. Yet the footmen who had marched beneath their banners were left to rot. Some were forced into slavery, set to toil in foreign lands. Others were executed swiftly, their bodies piled in ditches, forgotten before the sun set on the battlefield. The chronicles tell little of these men. Records celebrate noble rescues and grand exchanges, but seldom mention the nameless thousands left behind. Their suffering was unmarked, their families left in silence, waiting for sons and fathers who would never return. I once met a woman who still set a place at her table for her husband, years after he vanished into captivity. Her hope endured longer than the memory of those who had taken him. Enslavement was common, especially in border wars. Captured men became laborers in fields or rowers chained to galleys. Their names dissolved into the languages of their captors, their past erased. A man who had once borne arms for his king could die a stranger in a land he had never seen before. Freedom was a dream that dwindled with every lash of the overseer's whip, with every season spent far from home. Some prisoners faced execution, not for crimes but for the inconvenience of their survival. When food grew scarce or captors feared rebellion, captives were slain to ease the burden. Mass killings followed battles, not always out of vengeance but out of practicality. I recall a tale of soldiers executed by the sword after a siege, their bodies heaped together while their captors feasted. The cruelty lay not in rage, but in cold indifference. There were those who lingered in prisons, castles, or pits dug in the earth. Their lives dwindled in darkness, with little food, little water, and no promise of release. Disease swept through such places, ending more lives than the swords that had spared them. Some carved marks on walls to count the days, though the tally outlasted their strength. When the doors finally opened, only corpses greeted the light. The contrast between noble and common prisoner revealed the cruel order of society. Wealth meant survival. Poverty meant silence. A noble's ransom might build a castle, while a peasant's life was weighed as less than the grain he might consume. Justice played no role. Only value determined who was remembered and who was discarded. Such truths made the battlefield as much about class as about courage. Whenever I think of those men, it is not the noise of battle that returns to me, but the silence of absence. They vanished from hearths, from records, from prayers spoken at Mass. No graves marked their passing, no songs told of their endurance. The abandonment of prisoners of war was not only a loss of lives, but a loss of memory, their existence swallowed whole by the indifference of history. In the towns, guilds governed trades with strict order, shaping the lives of young apprentices who entered their doors. Boys, sometimes no older than 12, were placed under masters to learn a craft, bound by oath and years of service. For some, it was the beginning of skill and stability, but for others, it ended in rejection. A failed apprentice was not merely dismissed, he was cast adrift without trade, honor, or livelihood. I recall seeing one such youth wandering, clutching the tools he would never use again. The rules of guilds were unforgiving. Discipline was harsh, and failure to obey brought punishment or dismissal. If an apprentice proved clumsy, slow, or rebellious, he might be expelled before mastering the craft. To be cast out meant more than losing instruction. It meant exclusion from the only system that granted legitimacy. No guild would admit one who bore the stain of failure. The boy became an outcast in a world where every trade required belonging. Families who had sacrificed to secure apprenticeships for their sons often could do nothing once dismissal came. Their savings were lost, their hopes for a future squandered. Many boys left the towns, ashamed to face their kin. Some turned to begging, their youth protecting them only briefly from scorn. Others drifted into petty theft, finding in crime the only path left open when guild doors were closed. The fall was swift, and society showed no mercy. Masters sometimes abused their power, exploiting apprentices for labor with little intention of teaching them. A boy might spend years sweeping floors or hauling goods, never allowed to touch the tools of the trade. If he protested, dismissal followed, leaving him with neither skill nor standing. I once heard a dismissed apprentice cry out in anger that he had been robbed not of wages, but of a future. His words lingered long after his voice was gone. City authorities saw these cast-off youths as dangerous. Vagrancy laws swept them from the streets, branding them as idlers or thieves. Punishments included whipping, imprisonment, or expulsion from the city walls. In truth, hunger and rejection had driven them there, but law cared little for causes. The sight of their ragged figures haunted the alleys, a reminder that failure in a guild was a sentence extending beyond the workshop. Not all discarded apprentices vanished into despair. Some found new paths in unregulated labor, working as unskilled hands on docks or in markets. Their pay was meager, their status low, but it offered survival. Yet they carried the mark of disappointment, a shadow that followed them wherever they sought work. Guildmen looked down upon them, and townsfolk whispered of squandered opportunities. Even success outside the guild bore the taste of exclusion. The divide between guild-sanctioned craftsmen and the discarded revealed the rigidity of urban life. Trades provided order, but they also created walls higher than those of any castle. To be inside meant security. To be outside meant wandering, hunger, and shame. The strength of the system was built upon the weakness of those it expelled. This truth was seldom spoken, yet it shaped countless silent lives. What stays with me most is the look in their eyes, too young to carry such defeat, yet already aged by rejection. These apprentices did not lose merely a trade, they lost their place in the fabric of their towns. Cast away by the very system that promised them a future, they became another forgotten presence in the streets of medieval Europe. Their silence remains, woven into the dust of markets and alleys where they once stood. In the darkest hours of famine, when fields yielded nothing and granaries lay bare, chronicles whisper of acts too terrible for the tongue. Desperation drove men and women beyond the limits of nature, consuming the flesh of the dead, or in rare, harrowing accounts of the living. I recall reading of the Great Famine of 1315, when rains destroyed harvests and livestock perished, and even the chronicles themselves trembled to record the rumors of cannibalism. These tales, though rare, reveal the depth of abandonment suffered by the weakest. The victims in such stories were often the most vulnerable: children, the elderly, and the isolated. They lacked the strength to resist and the protection of family. In times when survival demanded impossible choices, these lives became the first to be sacrificed, either abandoned or consumed. I once heard a chronicler describe with horror a mother who left her infant at the roadside, knowing her milk had dried and no bread could be found. Such images remain etched in silence. While some dismiss these tales as exaggerations, their presence in records across regions suggests kernels of truth. Chroniclers in France, England, and Germany all spoke of bodies unearthed from shallow graves, not by beasts, but by men. Hunger stripped away not only flesh, but the dignity of humanity itself. In those moments, famine became not just the failure of crops, but the unraveling of society. Fear of such acts deepened the stigma of famine. Villages whispered about neighbors who might have committed the unspeakable. Families hid their dead quickly, fearing the desperation of others. I remember hearing a tale of a man who stood guard over his wife's corpse until burial, lest hunger drive someone to take her remains. Such fear shows how survival corrupted trust, setting man against man in silence. Children suffered the most in these times. Chronicles record that many vanished, their fate unspoken but feared. Some were sold into servitude, others left at monasteries, and still others became shadows in tales of despair. Their absence speaks louder than the words of any scribe. They were the silent victims of famine's cruelty, sacrificed not always by malice, but by hunger's relentless hand. The Church condemned cannibalism as the gravest of sins, equating it with betrayal of God's image in man. Yet priests themselves, starving alongside their flocks, could do little beyond prayer and ritual. Processions wound through villages, banners raised, hymns sung for divine mercy. But rain continued to fall, or drought continued to scorch, and bellies remained empty. Words of salvation could not fill the silence of gnawing hunger. When the famines ended, memory remained scarred. Villages spoke little of those years, ashamed of what desperation had forced them to endure. Yet the chronicles preserve fragments of the truth, stark reminders that beneath the veneer of faith and order lay a fragility too easily broken. Hunger did not only consume bodies, it consumed dignity, trust, and hope itself. When I reflect on these tales, I do not hear judgment, but sorrow. For in the eyes of famine, the human bond was tested to its breaking point, and the weakest were left to bear the cost. Their silence tells us more than any words could, that when bread is gone and hunger reigns, the line between man and beast grows perilously thin. It is in remembering them that we guard against forgetting the weight of despair. Among those most feared and forgotten in medieval life were women whose minds or bodies betrayed them in strange ways. Fits of epilepsy, sudden cries, or moments of delirium were seen not as illness but as signs of witchcraft or possession. I remember a woman in a market who collapsed in convulsions, foam at her lips, only to awaken to stones hurled at her feet. Her suffering was not met with care but with curses whispered as she was dragged away. Fear twisted their image into that of sorceresses. A widow who spoke too freely, or a healer whose herbs worked in mysterious ways, could quickly be accused of harboring dark forces. Madness in women was rarely seen as an ailment. It was seen as a danger. Neighbors turned whispers into accusations, and accusations into trials. Their fate was sealed not by proof but by suspicion, sharpened by superstition's blade. These women lived on the margins, often alone, their solitude feeding mistrust. Isolation itself became evidence of guilt, for to live without husband or kin was to invite suspicion. I recall walking past a hut at the edge of a forest where villagers said a woman lived who spoke to shadows. In truth, she likely spoke only to herself, yet her solitude made her a target. Accusations could be fatal. Trials of water or fire were demanded, where madness itself was seen as proof of evil. Some were cast into rivers to see if they floated, others burned as witches. Their cries, shaped by illness or despair, were taken as confessions. In these moments, society revealed its fear of what it could not understand, preferring to destroy what frightened it rather than to seek compassion. Not all were slain, though survival was seldom mercy. Many were driven into exile, cast from villages and left to wander forests or roadsides. Their hunger and cold were as lethal as the pyre. Some found refuge in monasteries, where a few nuns offered care, but such kindness was rare. More often, they lived unseen, their lives dissolving into the silence of forgotten paths. The cruelty was sharpened by contradiction. Men with similar afflictions were sometimes treated as holy fools or prophets, their madness cloaked in mystery. Women, however, bore the harsher judgment, their strangeness seen as a threat to order and morality. The same behavior that might earn a man reverence could condemn a woman to exile or death. This injustice weighed heavily on the lives of countless forgotten souls. Fear of mad women also revealed deeper anxieties about women's place in society. A wife who defied her husband, a daughter who resisted obedience, could be labeled as touched by spirits. Madness and disobedience blurred into one, making accusation a tool of control. Their suffering thus served not only as punishment for illness, but as reinforcement of the boundaries that held women in subservience. What stays with me most is the loneliness in their fate. They were not only cast aside, but their voices were twisted into proof against themselves. Madness made them vulnerable, and society made them guilty. Their presence lingers in memory, as a reminder that fear often silences compassion. In the fate of these women, one sees how ignorance turned suffering into crime and solitude into a death sentence. In the shadow of poverty, families sometimes faced choices that tore their hearts apart. When hunger pressed too sharply, children could be sold or given into service, their small bodies exchanged for survival. I recall hearing of peasants during the Great Famine who placed their children into the hands of strangers, knowing they would never see them again. Their tears were hidden, for grief had no place when survival demanded silence. Merchants and wealthier households welcomed such transactions, for they gained cheap labor. Boys became servants in kitchens or fields, and girls were often taken for domestic work, some facing exploitation beyond their years. Their parents, powerless, hoped at least for bread and shelter to replace their absence. Yet the bond of family was broken, replaced by contracts or by word alone. Childhood became a commodity, bartered in desperation. Not all children were sold for coin. Some were given away to monasteries or convents, their parents convincing themselves it was an act of piety. Cloisters took them in as novices, raising them in strict discipline. For a few, this life brought education and safety. Yet for many, it was a loss of freedom before freedom was ever known. Their cries for their mothers faded quickly within stone walls. Debt, too, often drove such surrender. Families unable to repay loans handed over children as servants to creditors. I once heard of a farmer who, to settle his dues, gave his young daughter into service for 7 years. The weight of the debt was lifted, but the emptiness in his home remained heavier than any coin. Such exchanges reveal how poverty devoured not only land and labor, but love itself. These children grew up without inheritance, their futures tied to masters rather than kin. Some rose within guilds or households, carving out new lives with skill and obedience. Yet others withered, crushed by harsh treatment, their youth spent in toil instead of play. Their names rarely entered records, for they were considered property more than persons. Their stories swallowed by the authority of others. The church condemned the outright sale of children, yet tolerated service as repayment of debt or as offering to monasteries. This contradiction left wide space for abuse. Priests preached of God's love for the innocent, yet often turned their eyes from the desperation that led to such acts. The voice of the poor seldom reached the ears of bishops, and so the practice endured in silence. Communities whispered of families that gave away their young, judging them harshly, though many faced the same threat. It was easier to condemn than to admit how fragile survival was. Behind closed doors, parents wept over empty cradles, but before neighbors they bore stoic faces. The shame of surrender was carried quietly, hidden beneath daily labor, yet it marked them as surely as famine itself. When I dwell on these memories, it is not the transactions that remain with me, but the absence that followed. The laughter of children lost, the silence of homes where small hands once played, the hollow eyes of parents who chose survival over kinship. These children were not only sold or given away, they were erased from the embrace of family. Their absence echoes still, a wound in history that cannot be healed. No one wishes to leave this world without dignity, yet for many in the Middle Ages, death offered no peace. The wealthy secured ornate tombs and masses sung in their name, while the poor were often left to the mercy of shallow earth. Bodies might be laid hurriedly outside consecrated ground, denied the sanctity of a proper resting place. The scent of decay hung heavy, a reminder of poverty's final cruelty. Gravediggers, paid poorly, sometimes refused to bury those who could not afford even a coffin. Corpses lay at the margins of cemeteries, half covered by soil that soon washed away in rain. Dogs and crows became the unholy attendants of these forgotten souls. For neighbors, such sights inspired fear, both of disease and of divine wrath upon those left untended. The plague years deepened the tragedy. Pits were dug hastily, and bodies tumbled together without prayer or blessing. Priests could not keep pace with the toll, and so many were cast into earth unmarked, their names never spoken again. Entire families vanished in these mass graves, swallowed by necessity rather than remembrance. To die poor was to die anonymous. Even in quieter times, the poor sometimes sold their burial plots while still alive, hoping the coin would keep their family fed. When death came, they were left without claim to holy ground. The church preached the equal worth of every soul, yet practice betrayed those who could not pay. Sacred soil became a privilege, not a promise. Legends grew of restless spirits wandering because their graves were denied. Villagers spoke of moans near graveyards, or shadows drifting on the edges of consecrated fields. Though superstition filled the silence, what truly haunted them was guilt, an unspoken recognition that poverty had stripped their neighbors of the last dignity. The living bore the shame as much as the dead. For the wealthy, tombstones carried prayers, carvings, and symbols of eternal rest. For the poor, a wooden cross, if any, marked the place of burial. These markers rotted quickly, and within years, even the memory of the dead dissolved. Generations passed without knowledge of those who had once labored in fields, built walls, or begged on streets. Silence replaced legacy. Communities sometimes sought to restore honor where coin had failed. Neighbors might gather to cover a pauper with stones, or say whispered prayers over a shallow grave. Such acts did not erase the inequality, but they softened the cruelty of abandonment. Small gestures of compassion kept alive the belief that all souls, regardless of wealth, deserved rest. When I reflect on the untended dead, I see not only their absence, but also the hierarchy that pursued them beyond life. Poverty followed them into the grave, marking them as lesser even before God's altar. Yet their silence speaks powerfully still, warning us that dignity must not be reserved for the rich, for in the end, all flesh returns to the same earth. When crusading armies thundered across Europe and the Near East, their path left not only blood, but emptiness. Villages burned, crops stolen, and homes abandoned, forced countless people into wandering exile. Women with children in their arms, the elderly leaning on sticks, and orphans trailing behind formed endless lines along dusty roads. They carried little more than fear and hunger, seeking shelter where none was offered. For these displaced multitudes, survival was a matter of chance. Rivers became graveyards for those who collapsed from exhaustion while trying to cross. Markets closed their doors to strangers, fearing disease or spies. Even monasteries, sworn to charity, often turned away refugees once their stores of bread ran thin. Hospitality, once sacred, bent under the weight of desperation. Some cities profited from misery. Refugees were exploited as cheap labor, working long hours for scraps of food. Others were enslaved outright, treated as spoils of war. The lucky few found sympathetic patrons or melted into distant towns where their past vanished. But most carried the scars of rejection, invisible yet heavier than any burden strapped to their backs. Children endured the harshest fate. Many became separated from their families amid chaos, wandering without guidance. Stories tell of little ones sold in foreign markets or absorbed into crusader camps as servants. Their voices, once playful in village streets, became cries for bread and warmth. Generations of futures dissolved before they had a chance to bloom. Religious justification offered little comfort. Preachers declared the suffering of refugees a trial of faith, insisting their endurance would be rewarded in heaven. Yet this did not ease the empty stomach or the frostbite of bare feet. Faith clashed with the tangible cruelty of displacement, revealing a bitter contradiction between sacred words and lived reality. Refugees sometimes banded together, forming temporary encampments on the edges of forests or ruined towns. These makeshift communities shared food, guarded against bandits, and offered companionship against despair. Around their fires, stories were told of lost homes, creating a fragile sense of belonging. In unity, they resisted the complete erasure of their lives. Despite their suffering, the wandering displaced left traces in the lands they passed through. Their songs, crafts, and accents blended into foreign soil, quietly shaping cultures that would forget their origins. History rarely names them, yet their invisible migration altered borders, economies, and languages more than the battles that displaced them. When we remember the Crusades, it is easy to count armies and victories, but true cost lies not in the clash of knights, but but in the endless footsteps of those driven from hearth and home. Their silent procession across the medieval world reveals the war's cruelest legacy, a trail of suffering that reshaped humanity in shadows. The forgotten of the Middle Ages walked silently through history's corridors, their names erased before ink could dry. Peasants without land, children without parents, and beggars without homes all carried the weight of invisibility. In chronicles filled with kings and knights, they were absent, though they outnumbered all. Their absence was not by accident, but by design, for those who lacked power rarely earned memory. Yet their struggles left marks beyond parchment. The fields tilled by the poor-fed castles, and the stones carried by nameless labourers still stand in cathedrals. Their contribution was quiet, but without it, the grandeur of medieval society would have collapsed. Forgotten, they remain hidden foundations, holding up a history that chose not to see them. For many, dignity was stripped at birth. Poverty dictated their lot, binding them to hunger and hardship that neither prayer nor promise could undo. Disease often claimed them before adulthood, and those who survived bore scars of famine or war. To the powerful, they were replaceable. Another hand for the plough, another back for the burden. But there were whispers, faint rebellions of memory. Folk songs carried their sorrows, and tales around the hearth spoke of suffering and resilience. In these oral traditions, the voiceless regained something history denied. The songs echoed longer than ink, flowing across generations as reminders that humanity cannot be entirely silenced. Their fate exposes the brutal mechanics of survival in times of scarcity. When grain was scarce, charity dried up and compassion shrank within fortified walls. A neighbour could become a rival, a hungry child a burden, and a widow a mouth too many. In that darkness, the measure of worth was narrowed to survival alone. Still, the forgotten shaped the moral conscience of ages to come. Their pain revealed the fragility of compassion, urging later generations to question cruelty and exclusion. Monastic records of almsgiving, though scarce, arose because of the pressing presence of the poor. Even indifference could not fully erase their impact, for suffering leaves traces in memory's soil. Archaeology uncovers fragments of their lives, unmarked graves, tools worn to stubs, huts reduced to ash. Each shard tells a story no scribe bothered to record. These mute witnesses whisper of endurance and neglect, and in their silence lies a truth sharper than any chronicle. Objects outlasted words, carrying their existence into the present. To restore dignity is to speak of them now. By remembering those whom fear and scarcity cast aside, we challenge the notion that worth is measured by power or survival. Their legacy is not in triumph, but in the reminder that every soul carries weight, whether or not history cared to notice.